doing little musical chairs, little ADHD, little backwards, and spun around with the little structure. Did the triple linguistic trap first, but this probably should have been the first one, so, whatever. Alright, so, Schrödinger's autism when categories collapse. When I was a child, I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. As an adult philosopher who has found psychological and spiritual health, I no longer test as neurodivergent. So, what am I? Did I stop being autistic? Was I never autistic? Or am I revealing something more unsettling? That our categories themselves are broken. I call this Schrödinger's autism, and it's not just about me. It's about how we've built an entire system that medicalizes human variation instead of understanding it. Act 1, the personal narrative. So let me tell you my story, because the personal is philosophical here. As a child, the label fit. I struggled with what they call social deficits. Eye contact felt wrong, unspoken roles were invisible to me. I was handled a diagnosis, Asperger syndrome, and with it an identity. But here's what's fascinating. Even as a child, I rejected that pathology model. I told people my autism wasn't good or bad, I was just further evolved. Adults smiled at me the way they smile at children who say they want to be astronauts. Cute, naive, a coping mechanism. Except I was right. Recent scientific studies have confirmed what I intuited as a child. Autistic neurology isn't a deficit model, but a different evolutionary expression of human cognition. Different trade offs, different strengths, different ways of processing reality. Fast forward to now. I've become what you might call a polymathic philosopher. I've developed a faith I call transdualistic transtheism, a framework that transcends simple binaries. I've cultivated psychological health, spiritual depth, and genuine connection, and then something strange happened. I took the diagnostic assessments again out of curiosity. I no longer met the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. The obvious question, did I change or did the measuring stick? The answer is yes, and that childhood intuition about evolution, it's about to get much bigger. Act 2, the DSM recategorization. Here's the first layer of absurdity. Asperger syndrome doesn't exist anymore. Not because the neurology changed, but because the DSM 5 folded it into autism spectrum disorder in 2013. So technically, I was diagnosed with a condition that no longer exists, diagnosed with something that it was never really a discrete thing to begin with, but rather a point on a spectrum that itself is tested. This isn't a somatic shift. It reveals how psychiatric categories are social constructs as much as medical discoveries. The boundaries move, the definitions evolved. What was pathological becomes normal. What was normal gets medicalized. I exist in the same body within the same brain, but the category has shifted around me like continental drift. Act 3, the double empathy problem. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's this concept in autism research called the double empathy problem, proposed by Damian Milton. The traditional view says autistic people lack empathy or social skills, but Milton flipped this. Maybe the problem isn't that autistic people can't understand neurotypical people. Maybe it's that there's a mutual failure of understanding. Neurotypical people struggle just as much to understand autistic communication. It's not a deficit. It's a difference in operating systems trying to interface. And here's what I realized as I learned to code switch, to translate between neurological dialects. I didn't stop being different. I just became bilingual. I learned the neurotypical language without losing my native tongue. But our diagnostic tools only measure fluency in one language, so suddenly I passed as neurotypical. The test couldn't capture that I was now operating as a translator rather than having fundamentally changed. Ah, this is funny, man. Everything I'm seeing, I'm like, I agree with this, but I also disagree with this. It's pointing toward the right path. It's getting into the meta modern, but it's still stuck in its dualistic, biases. It can't grasp the transdualism that it revealed to me. Act 4, knowing that versus knowing how. This brings us to philosophy of mind, the distinction between propositional knowledge and procedural knowledge, between knowing that and knowing how. I learned how to make eye contact. Eye contact. Uh, excuse me. Let me go back and get back to Act 4. So what I was getting at with just the disagreeing with the test couldn't capture how I was operating as a translator rather than having fundamentally changed. That I was now operating as a translator rather than having fundamentally changed. Yeah, my autism didn't fundamentally change, but becoming a trans dualist, I definitely say was a fundamental change. I'd be willing to bet if you checked out fMRI studies of before and after, you'd see a vast shift. So back to Act 4. This brings us to the philosophy of mind, the distinction between propositional knowledge and procedural knowledge, between knowing that and knowing how. I learned how to make eye contact, how to read certain social cues, how to navigate neurotypical expectations. This is procedural knowledge, embodied, practical, performative. But does that mean that I now intrinsically know that eye contact signals attention in the way neurotypical people do? That I understand small talk serves social bonding rather than information exchange at some fundamental intuitive level? This is the explanatory gap, the chasm between third-person observation and first-person experience, between behavior and phenomenology. The diagnostic criteria measure behavior. They can't measure qualia, what it's like to be me from the inside. So they miss this the entire experiential dimension. I've learned to form neurotypically. The question is whether this is the same thing as being neurotypical, and whether the question even makes sense. This is like the frickin' Theseus's boat question, man. Like, replace everything off the boat, rebuild the boat from the exact same, blueprints, but completely different wood. Is it the same boat? Is it different? Like, man, philosophy is fun. But this is where I was just realizing too, I think part of the bias right here in the dualistic bias isn't even necessarily a bias. It's just in the steps of order and where like I said, I do a little musical chairs here apparently. So, the most recent one I'm doing after this video, it seems to be sort of getting what this framework doesn't get. So, yeah, if you're actually interested in this, you might want to actually, play a little musical chairs with the videos, actually go in the right order, because it's not chronological right here, it's not in order of release. So, Act 5, Schrödinger's Autism. So here's where we are. Schrödinger's autism. Am I autistic or not? The answer depends on which framework you use. By childhood diagnosis, yes. By current testing, no. By DSM-5 criteria, the category has changed. By double empathy theory, I'm just code switching. By phenomenological experience, depends on the day. By my childhood intuition, I was always further evolved. It exists in superposition, simultaneously autistic and not, until someone opens the box and forces a measurement, which itself changes the system. But here's where my childhood self understood something that adults around me didn't. What if this ambiguity isn't a problem to be solved, but a signal pointing towards something larger? What if the reason I can't be categorized isn't because the categories are just socially constructed, although they are, but because human consciousness itself is still in the middle of an evolutionary transition that current categories can't quite capture? Act 6, the evolutionary leap. Stay here with me here, because this is where it gets wild. That childhood intuition about being further evolved, it wasn't about superiority or ego. It was about difference as developmental variation, and now I'm seeing the same pattern at a larger scale. Most people, I've come to realize, are cognitively limited to either dualistic or non-dualistic frameworks, not because they're less intelligent, but because of the current constraints of their human biological reality. Dualistic thinking, this or that, good or evil, autistic or neurotypical, true or false. It's the binary code of human reasoning, and it works for a certain level of complexity. Non-dualistic thinking, this and that, both and, neither nor. The recognition that that apparent opposites interpenetrate. It's more sophisticated, more integrated. Eastern philosophy has explored this for millennia. But here's where what here but here is what I'm proposing. Transdualism isn't just another framework competing with these. It's not the answer, because there is no final answer to be found. Instead, it's a guide in the right direction, an ontological zeitgeist that can move humanity forward from where we are currently stalled. We're stuck in postmodernism. We've successfully deconstructed all the grand narratives, revealed all the power structures, showed that every truth is perspectival. But then what? We fragmented into infinite micro narratives with no way to build coherent meaning together. Transdualism, as I understand it, is the cognitive capacity to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously, dualistic, non-dualistic, and others, while recognizing that all frameworks are provisional tools for navigating reality. They are not reality itself. It's metacognitive flexibility that doesn't collapse into relativism because it understands that some tools work better than others in specific contexts. This is the transmodern worldview, not rejecting modernity or postmodernity, but transcending and including them, giving us new means for discovering perspective itself. And here's the kicker. Just like my autism couldn't be measured by tools designed for a different paradigm, transdualistic consciousness can't be fully grasped by minds still operating primarily in dualistic or non-dualistic modes. The explanatory gap remains. The same gap between knowing that and knowing how, between third-person observation and first-person experience. Because that gap might not be solvable from our current evolutionary position, we might be like a caterpillar trying to understand what it means to fly. We lack the wings. Act 7, the recursive pattern. Now, watch how this pattern repeats, because this is where it gets beautiful. My childhood intuition about autism was a form of precognitive knowing. My neurology understood something about itself that couldn't yet be articulated in the language available to me. The adults heard I'm further evolved and heard arrogance. What I was actually experiencing was a kind of phenomenological clarity about my own difference that didn't require academic validation. Years later, science caught up. Studies confirm that autistic cognition represents genuine evolutionary diversity, not deficiency. Now I'm having the same experience with transdualism. I can feel the cognitive shift, the capacity to try to navigate between frameworks, the way consciousness itself feels different when you try to stop trying to find the one true answer and instead learn to dance between provisional truths. But I can't fully explain it to someone who hasn't experienced it yet. The explanatory gap remains, not because I'm special, but because consciousness is describing consciousness. The I trying to see itself. The I trying to see itself seeing. Yes, the I trying to see itself seeing. This is crucial to understand. I'm not claiming I have the answer. I'm claiming I'm part of a broader evolutionary current that some of us, maybe through neurodiversity, maybe through contemplative practice, maybe through psychedelic experience, maybe through philosophical rigor, are developing the cognitive scaffolding for this next phase. And just like my autism was called a disorder when it was really a difference, this transdualistic capacity might seem incomprehensible or even threatening to those still operating in purely dualistic or non-dualistic frameworks. The same systems that pathologized my childhood neurology are now struggling to make sense of people who don't stay in neat conceptual boxes, who seem to be autistic and not autistic, who hold multiple truths without contradiction, who transcend categories by embodying their porousness. Act 8, the cultural crisis. And this is what brings us to the real crisis we're facing as a species. We're trapped in a fragmented postmodern landscape where every truth is equally valid or equally suspect, where we can't build shared meaning, where we're all talking past each other because we're operating in incompatible frameworks with no meta-language to bridge them. Dualistic thinking gave us certainty, but also fundamentalism, colonialism, and oppression through rigid binaries. Non-dualistic thinking gave us wisdom and integration, but struggles to function in a world that requires decisions, boundaries, and action. Postmodernism gave us liberation from oppressive grand narratives, but left us with no way to coordinate collective action or shared values. What I'm proposing, what I think transdualism points toward, is not a new ideology to replace these, but a new cognitive capacity to work with in all of them contextually, to recognize when dualistic thinking serves us in law and engineering and ethics, and when it limits us. I would also expand and go, no, it's not just, freaking Unitarianism, and freaking law and engineering and ethics. That's part of the problem. That's the dualistic the bias, the psychological splitting. Why haven't we shifted into egalitarianism yet? If I'm using that word correctly, I'm a little spun around at the moment. Hope I'm not saying egalitarianism. Or wait, did I just say that? I'm mixing the freaking word of the ethical word of the Aryanism, the Itarianism or whatever versus the agrarian. That's what it was. Okay, I think I was using the right word then. I'm not talking freaking ontology of farm working or whatnot. So to access non-dualistic awareness when we need to dissolve false boundaries and to see interconnection, to apply postmodern critique without losing our ability to build meaning. This is what I mean by an ontological zeitgeist, a shift in how we collectively make sense of reality that emerges from enough individuals developing this metacognitive flexibility. Not because one person figured it out, but because consciousness itself is evolving, distributed across many minds, many experiences, many neurodiversities, all feeling our way toward the next plateau. My Schrödinger's autism isn't just my story. It's a canary in the coal mine, showing us that our categories are breaking down because we're growing beyond them. Conclusion. So where does this leave us? With three interlocking insights that mirror each other perfectly. First, my childhood self was right. Autism wasn't a disorder, but a different evolutionary expression. Science eventually confirmed this, but I knew it phenomenologically before it had the language. Second, the reason I now exist in diagnostic superposition, simultaneously autistic and not, isn't just about flawed categories. It's because I'm embodying a transition that the categories themselves can't capture. I've learned to operate across multiple neurological languages in a way that makes them legible to some frameworks and invisible to others. Third, this exact pattern, this capacity to exist between and beyond categories is what transdualism represents at the level of consciousness itself. It's not the final answer, because the explanatory gap remains. We still can't fully bridge the gulf between describing consciousness and experiencing it, between knowing that and knowing how. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the gap is telling us we're in mid-evolution. We're not supposed to understand flight while we're still building the wings. What I'm offering isn't a solution. It's a direction. A recognition that human consciousness is not a fixed thing, but a dynamic process. And right now we're in an awkward transitional phase where the old categories are breaking down, but the new ones have yet to have fully emerged. We're all living in some version of Schrödinger's box, caught between paradigms, existing in multiple states simultaneously, and the discomfort we feel culturally, politically, existentially might not be because we're doing something wrong, but because we're doing something unprecedented. We're trying to think our way past the limits of a thought itself, to categorize the breakdown of categories, to find certainty in a reality that refuses to hold still. My journey from diagnosed autistic child to a psychologically integrated adult is diagnostically ambiguous philosopher isn't about personal triumph. It's about riding a wave that's bigger than any individual, an evolutionary current that's moving through our species, inviting us into new ways of making meaning together. Transdualism, in this sense, is a compass rather than a destination, pointing us from fragmented postmodernism toward a transmodern worldview where we can hold multiple perspectives together without losing our capacity for coherent action and shared values, where difference becomes diversity rather than disorder, where the explanatory gap becomes an invitation rather than a problem. I'm Sage DeForest, and as a child, I was told I had a disorder. I said I was further evolved, and turns out I was right. but not in the way I thought. The evolution wasn't just personal, it's collective, and you're part of it too, whether you know it or not. The categories are dissolving, consciousness is expanding, the explanatory gap remains, and honestly, that's exactly where I think we need to be. So thanks for evolving with me on this fun little journey. This has been Sage DeForest. Peace and victory. Signing out.